This session is going to focus on an overview of photosynthesis, including the types of organisms that can actually photosynthesize or make their own food, and the components of the plant itself that are involved in this process. We'll start with the general equation for photosynthesis. When we talk about photosynthesis, we're actually talking about the combination of carbon dioxide and water into glucose, with the byproduct of oxygen gas produced. We can also look at water as being a byproduct of this process, so we have it as a reactant and a product, but we'll get into that more later when we look at the energy transfers. For our purposes, we'll focus on the production of glucose primarily in the organisms and what benefit that has to the organisms. Autotrophs are the organisms that will actually make their own food or go through photosynthesis. When we talk about an autotroph, auto we can think of as being self. So when we look at an organism that is able to produce foods for itself through photosynthesis, we look at them as being autotrophs, but we would generally talk about them as being plants. We have to be kind of careful with this because, yes, plants go through photosynthesis, but what else does? We'll actually look later on when we talk about evolution at a number of bacteria that can also photosynthesize. So we'll talk about those, but primarily we look at plants. Secondarily, we have to think about bacteria. Bacteria are more simple organisms, remember from Biology 1, so we have to look at them as not only a contributor to this process, but also potentially the first organisms to photosynthesize on our planet. So when we look at photoautotrophs, these are organisms that are going to use light energy to actually produce those organic molecules. And when we say organic molecules here, we're going to talk about simply the C6H12O6 or glucose. Okay. Chemoautotrophs, on the other hand, so they're still making their own food because they're autotrophs, but the chemo part of it indicates that they're actually going to use inorganic chemicals as their energy source. So in our light energy with our photoautotrophs, we talk about the sunshine as being our source of energy. But when we look at chemoautotrophs, we can actually look at inorganic chemicals as their source of energy. Where might you find organisms like this? Well, these would fall into the category that we often talk about as extremophiles. Extremophiles are found in extreme environments, as the name suggests. So chemoautotrophs might be found in vents in the ocean. They might be found in volcanoes or other areas that we'll consider when we look more at their types of species. Heterotrophs, these are organisms that we're more familiar with on a daily basis. These are going to be any organism that feeds on plant animals, or is a plant or an animal, and feeds on plants and animals. So these are not organisms that can produce their own food. So when we say that the organism is feeding on something, suggesting that it cannot produce its own food and it's reliant on other organisms to do that for them. So we will look at plants as producing food for organisms such as cows, elephants, you. To date, you can't produce your own food internally, so we have to look at other ways to get it. We'll also talk about decomposers. One of the primary decomposers that you would be familiar with would be mushrooms. We also can put bacteria in this category. You'll see that bacteria take on a lot of roles as we go through these different processes. In photosynthesis, we're actually going to look at it taking place inside of something called a chloroplast. The chloroplast is a specific organelle inside the cells of plants that are going to help us convert carbon dioxide and water into those organic molecules. Or again, what did we say those organic molecules were for us? Right. When we look at organic molecules, we're going to talk about glucose for our primary purposes. And then they're going to release oxygen. In this case, we say that oxygen is a byproduct. The plant produces oxygen in this process, but that is not the primary goal of photosynthesis. The primary goal of photosynthesis is to produce glucose. So this is a couple of examples of plants that are going to be photosynthesizing, and a number of algae that will be photosynthesizing and producing high levels of glucose and oxygen. The tree you're probably pretty familiar with. So when we look outside, we can see trees and grass and plants and flowers. And we typically think about green plants as being some of the best photosynthesizers, but what we'll see is we actually have a number of different colors for plants. Plant color is dependent on pigments or coloration that will actually have a direct effect on the photosynthetic rates of the plant. So we'll look into those more later on. This is actually a protist. Protists are an in-between category of organisms that we'll look at in evolution. They play a very important role. This is kelp. For those of you that like ice cream, kelp or seaweed is often an additive to make your ice cream very smooth and creamy. It's just an algae. The last one that we see here is something called a cyanobacteria. Now, don't let its name fool you. A cyanobacteria is not actually a bacteria, and we'll talk about that later on. But it's named because it is actually a prokaryote, and it is a photosynthetic prokaryote. So remember, prokaryotes generally we talk about as being bacteria. This one in particular produces very high levels of oxygen, and when we talk about evolutionary traits in our world and the progress of production of organisms on our planet, we'll look at them as being a very high contributor because they're simple and they produce very high levels of oxygen early on. So the chloroplasts that we mentioned are what make our green plants green because they contain a pigment known as chlorophyll. So the only thing that is making those plants green is its photosynthetic pigment known as chlorophyll. These are what will actually absorb the light inside our chloroplasts and help us absorb enough solar energy to convert our CO2 and our water into our glucose and our oxygen. Are you getting the sense that this equation is important? You should be. We'll talk about it a lot, and you should be very familiar with it. So our chloroplasts are actually located in the mesophyll, or the ground tissue on the inside of the leaf. Don't let ground tissue confuse you. I talk to a lot of students that think about ground tissue as only something that occurs associated with the ground. In this case, ground is more like filling for our plants. So when we look at this ground tissue, what we're actually talking about is the squishy fibrous parts inside our plant that when you eat something like celery, you can think about all of that ground tissue, that inner filling of a plant inside. Now, what we'll look at is that this ground tissue is through every part of the plant and is full of chloroplasts. The only place we don't see chloroplasts, of course, would be roots. So we're not looking for our roots to be photosynthetic. When we talk about trees, we'll talk about bark not being photosynthetic, but it certainly does have tissue that is alive associated with it, and we'll look at that more later on. Stomata become a very important part of our plant and photosynthesis discussion. These are going to be holes on the undersides of the leaves, and we'll look at those more, and I'll show you more specific details about those in a minute. But what we want to focus on is that this is where we actually get carbon dioxide in and oxygen out of our plant. The other thing we look at is the stomata have to be regulated. And so when we look at regulation of our stomata, what we're actually regulating is water. We don't want our plants to become dehydrated. If they do, they cannot do photosynthesis. So we'll look at that and talk about that more. The veins in our leaves are actually what's going to move water around. We'll look at water moving primarily up our plant, and we'll look at our glucose as moving down our plant. And we'll talk more about that with vascular tissue in our plants in a little while. This is what the diagram in most books looks like associated with our plant leaf structures. It's a very basic diagram just to orient you to what's going on. You see the stoma here. The stoma, in this case, are actually the holes. So the stoma is the hole. What the green cells are surrounding that stoma are actually known as guard cells. So they're guarding the water inside that plant from escaping too fast. But we also don't want your plant to become waterlogged either, so they'll help release water as needed. We'll talk about that more with vascular tissue. So if we look at this, primarily our stoma are located on the bottoms of our leaves, but they do have stoma on both sides, so don't let that confuse you just because they're not drawn on this top side. We do have some on both sides. The vein that we talked about is what's going to move water and glucose for us. The actual mesophyll cells, if you look at the cross-section here, you see that the chloroplasts are pushed to the outside of those cells, right? So we have them lining this cell. And what we're going to look for with the photosynthetic pigments being pushed to the outside is a better exposure to the sunlight. So our chloroplasts actually have several compartments associated with them. Now this is where some of the photosynthetic terms become confusing. So we just talked about stoma. We just talked about our stoma as being a hole in our cells, or a hole in our leaves that regulates water, right? But now we introduced stroma with an R. The stroma are actually fluid-filled compartments that are going to help us maintain a healthy environment in which photosynthesis can occur, and we deliver all the nutrients that are needed for that process. And it will help us to transport sugars when we're all done. When we put all this together, we actually put them into stacks called thylakoids. Let me show you the picture because it's easier for you than just looking at the verbs. These thylakoids are going to be in stacks within this space, and so what we want to look for is these chlorophyll molecules. So what I need you to help me do in the next figure here is find where we would actually have chlorophyll. So look at the diagram. Where within this diagram would you expect to find the chlorophyll molecules or the photosynthetic pigments needed for photosynthesis? Well, we have all of these stacks, right? We said that these stacks are actually going to be referred to as something called granham. So when we look at these stacks, we're interested in this word right here, this granham, okay? And they're stacks, and you see that there's a lot of space inside these stacks. That's going to be important for us later on when we talk about energy. But the stacks themselves, you can think about almost like a pack of lifesavers. What do you think stacking things like this would actually do? Remember, these cells are going to be fairly small, okay? So the chloroplast itself, remember, is an organelle inside the cell, so it's even smaller than the cell itself. So these stacks are allowing us to increase the surface area in which we can do photosynthesis. So we're packing more photosynthetic pigments into one place by stacking things like this. Now, I asked you where you thought the chlorophyll might be. Well, remember, chlorophyll is a green pigment, right? So everything that you see is green inside this chloroplast is going to be chlorophyll. So that means within these grana, within these thylakoids, we're going to have lots and lots and lots of photosynthetic pigments to help us with this process. Stroma, that funny word with the R that we were talking about a minute ago, is just this space. And in biology we name a lot of spaces because processes occur between structures and spaces. So we need to have a space so that we can actually think about what's moving between that particular organelle, or within that organelle between structures and the space itself. So in the next session, what we want to think about is how we actually know photosynthesis occurs, and we'll look at it as a process. But scientists have started to work with photosynthesis in the 1800s or so, and started to think about where the different components are coming from, where oxygen and carbon dioxide are coming into play, and how we know why these different parts play such a critical role for photosynthesis.